Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure today to make my report, National Land Development and Government Real Property, which I recently submitted to the Legislative Assembly. I have with me today Martin Rubin, the audit principal responsible for the OEG's performance audit practice and this audit in particular. I will start by making some opening comments, which will be followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions about the report. The management of the development of the Cayman Islands is one of the most important roles of the government. The role is described in the Constitution and in legislation and includes planning and the operation of important government programs and services. With significant growth in its population over the last 15 years of over 40%, the government has had to deal with significant challenges to ensure that development is well managed. Looking ahead, the government faces a number of significant infrastructure projects using innovative financing in the wake of a scarcity of funds. We address this important topic because government's role in the development of land and its ability to perform it well is critical to the future of the Cayman Islands. Therefore, the objective of this audit was to determine whether the Cayman Islands government is adequately managing land, use, and development to meet government objectives, both for the Cayman Islands in general and also for Crown lands in particular. This audit was wide-ranging in its scope and included the following key areas: government's framework for land use planning and development, including the role of various agencies, such as the Department of Planning, the Central Planning Authority, Development Control Board, the Water Authority, and the Department of the Environment. Government's framework for the management of its own real property, in other words, Crown land, and whether government agencies manage properties to achieve the highest and best use of them. The framework in place for the management of public-private partnerships. As well as conducting a general review of management systems and sampling transactions, we carried out in-depth case studies of the NRA agreement, the Health City agreement, and South Sound, covering Emerald Sound and the Adagio development. Now, looking at the key findings from the report, there are several areas where government can improve how it manages both privately and publicly owned land in the Cayman Islands. We found that the development plan is neither comprehensive nor up to date. The law requires the Central Planning Authority to carry out a fresh survey of the development plan every 5 years and submit a report to the Legislative Assembly with proposals for alterations or additions. This was last done in 1997. The failure to update the plan has had negative effects. There is no plan to guide planning and development decisions, with development taking place on an ad hoc basis. Wider sustainable development objectives, including environmental and social objectives, are not considered sufficiently in recent planning development decisions. For example, whilst the development plan in 1997 states that environmental protection is a policy objective, as does the Cayman Islands Constitution Order 2009, actual development decisions have overridden this goal. The strategy of the development plan in 1997 to encourage conservation of fresh water supplies, develop new sources of supply, and provide for effective drainage and prevention of pollution has not been fully supported. While I understand the challenges to come up with a comprehensive development plan for the Cayman Islands, there is no excuse for development to be taking place on such an ad hoc basis. A development plan required by the planning law would provide greater assurance that future generations will have these beautiful islands available for their use. We also found that decisions regarding land use are not always transparent. The Central Planning Authority and the Development Control Board publish submissions made to them, but their deliberations are not open to the public, and objections or recommendations by technical authorities, such as the Water Authority, are often overruled or ignored without explanation. Finally, in respect to private land management, the enforcement of standards and codes in place to maintain public safety and community standards is weak due to resourcing and structural issues. Looking at the government management of its own real property portfolio, there is more that can be done to ensure that it is effectively managed, in particular its surplus inventory. At the time of our audit, the government owned 279 properties valued at $60 million, not required for operations, including houses and condos. The government has recently put in place a process to review holdings and to dispose of surplus properties. Finally, our audit shows that more needs to be done to create a framework for the management of public-private partnerships, or PPPs, in particular around assessing whether they meet value for money and affordability tests. The case studies we examined demonstrate that there was inadequate consideration of value for money or future obligations. With restrictions on government's ability to raise capital from the market or generate sufficient internal capital, it appears that future major development of infrastructure will not necessarily be government-led or completely government-financed. The FFR, which is now embedded in the Public Management and Finance Law, provides an outline of the principles that are used to manage PPPs, but detailed policies and procedures for the management to fulfill its roles required to be developed, with the principles of value for money and affordability at the centre. In conclusion, this report raises some fundamental issues, both for the management of land across the Cayman Islands and also for the management of government expenditure. Development and land management are critical roles of the government that affect everyone living in the Cayman Islands, and therefore it is crucial that it is guided by clear plans that articulate the balance to be struck between the sometimes competing objectives of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. As a consequence, it is also fundamentally important that planning and development decisions are open and transparent and consider the relevant input from technical experts. Finally, the creation of a procurement office and a major capital projects office should strengthen the government's management framework and result in more effective management of PPPs and major capital projects in the future. And I believe we are already starting to see some of the benefits. But more needs to be done to formalise a detailed framework to ensure future PPP deals are well managed and deliver value for money. Thank you for your attention, and I want to take any questions you have about the report.
I have one question.
Yes.
Joe Avery, Cayman 27. Are there any projects in particular you can point to that had negative effects due to the lack of a planning regime since 1997? Are there any particular ones that you can point to as a big red flag?
Specific projects. Do we have any details in the report?
Well, in the report, we provide some examples of, I would call it decisions made by the CPA, and as well we talk about, of course, the NRA agreement, which was not subject to an environmental impact assessment. So we found a number of instances. We didn't go through a detailed list, but what we found was that there was no, in many cases, there were no clear impact, environmental impact assessments or whatever. So we felt that the risks associated with these projects was high. Did we look at the actual impacts of these developments? The answer is no.
Morning, gentlemen. Wendy from Cayman News Service. We always ask this question because you frequently tell us that the government is breaking the law when it does these things. And in this case, you not only got pointing the finger at the Shetty deal and the NRA DART deal as being unlawful, you also point to purchases on Cayman Brac of land and a house that also appear to be more than unlawful. In this case, you point to a possible breach of trust, as there was no evidence that government required this land or this property at all, and there seemed to be no policy at all to support it. Are you taking this further? I mean, I'm guessing no, because you've published the report, but can you tell us again? Because this has got to be your hammer. I don't know, the 6th or 7th time you've told us that government's broken the law and nothing's happened.
Yeah. Wendy, well, as with every report...
I've got more, but I'll pass it on because I'm sure everybody does.
With every report, as I've told you before, I always provide a briefing on my reports to the Anti-Corruption Commission, for example, and determines whether we take that information forward in any form of investigation for them. In terms of the breaches of the law, we're talking about, generally speaking, the breaches of the Public Management and Finance Law, and not complying with the governance arrangements that are complied within that. And as I've said before, the challenges around that is whether there's anything enforceable in terms of any provisions around that. The reality is it's about, in large, it's not respecting the governance arrangements that are in place per the law in terms of the roles and responsibilities of ministers versus chief of officers and things like that. And as I've said, the public management finance law has no real remedies attached to it that we can see at this moment in time.
Gentlemen, I want to just pick right up on what Mr. Swarbrick just said there. Point 108 of the report, since you were just discussing the not following the PMFL
Yeah.
and the unlawful activity, perhaps, as opposed to the illegal activity. Officials express the opinion that when matters of national importance are being negotiated, individual transactions take on policy significance, and it is not practical to exclude ministers from them regardless of the governance framework of the CIG. So what is that? That is something that someone in government said to you?
That's the feedback we had. And the reality is I have some sympathy with some of that position. But if they want to be moving forward in that way, they need to revise their governance framework and structures under the law to be clear that that's allowable.
Right, but someone who said, was this when you asked this question? It doesn't say who made the response, or did someone in the current government say this, or was this the response of the other government when you're referring to the NRA health city issues?
This is responsible officials from within government.
So, what do you make of that? I mean, that's like saying, well, this is the I don't know whether you call it the law, but this is the procedure we're supposed to follow. But if we don't feel like it, we're not going to bother if we think it's important enough. I mean, really, that was their answer. And what do you make of that?
This is a challenging issue, and it's something that we continue to see across most of our audits, or have seen. And it's that grey area around where does political responsibility start and stop, and the official responsibility start and stop. And it continues to be a debate. And I personally think there needs to be an open and frank discussion about that, so that we can actually get a resolved position around this, and that they can actually then put that effectively into any future legislation to amend this. And how it stands at the moment, from my perspective, it's not sufficient, and it potentially compromises deals and transactions. But if that's what they believe and what they think is appropriate, they have to take that decision and move forward with revised legislation, from my perspective.
Well, just because you were talking about openness and transparency, it seems like they punted the issue of opening the CPA minutes to that actual authority. The government says, oh, it's up to them. So have you had any response from them about whether or not they'll be making those?
Not at this time. I think government have a role here in terms of trying to ensure that there is open accountability and transparency. Government appoints the CPA. They can set the terms and conditions on how they operate as well. They can have some real influence in that. So I think there should be a real clear discussion about how they make sure that that is open and transparent. And obviously we're fairly clear in our view that meetings of the CPA or the DCB and the BRAC should be open to the public. Should be public meetings. I think from our perspective that is fundamentally important for planning and development decisions. And that's from my experience all over. I've seen it from other jurisdictions around the world, and that's how it normally operates.
Ralph Lewis, Cayman Weekly. There are a number of ongoing projects that are happening right now, and the future projects that are planned. Does the report cover any of those projects? And if it does, do you see any changes in the way things are being done at this time?
At present, this report does not specifically cover any of the current major projects that we're seeing, like the port, the airport, or the dump. That's something that we're going to be looking at in the future, obviously. It refers to previous experience around PPPs and other projects, and showed that there was significant gaps around those and issues around the assessment of value for money. What I can say at this moment in time is that what we're seeing is a lot better from what we've seen in the past in terms of doing that assessment of value for money and other things like environmental impact assessments. So the planning, what we're seeing is a lot better, but we still see the clear need to make sure that it is formalized more thoroughly in policies and procedures by government, to ensure that in future all projects follow an appropriate process and there's no opportunity for things that we've seen in the past to happen again.
clearly those improvements are happening at the cabinet level with processes, but we've still got the problem of the CPA. I mean, you've pointed to some issues that have been, the situation with the quarrying not being. There's a lot of campaigning going on, if you like, because a lot of people have raised these issues, and they're coming up against a brick wall.
Mm-hmm.
So although you're saying it's improving, in actual fact, we're still seeing the CPA barrel ahead with decisions that without any justification.
I wasn't talking about the CPA when I was talking about those issues. I was talking about the major projects in terms of their management and their governance framework. I think there has to be a clear discussion about the role of the CPA, how it's configured, and how its meetings are held, and the opportunity for objections and other matters in public. Land and development decisions are fundamentally important to the Cayman Islands and how it develops in the future and what is left for other people, for the future generations. So I think there needs to be a clear discussion about this and taking into account the findings in our report and recommendations to make sure that it's improved, the situation is made more transparent, more open, so people can see how the decisions are made and on what basis they are made, and that the technical advice of experts is taken into account. And when it's not, why not? I think that's one of the main considerations. Why is technical advice that's provided around certain things like quarrying, as you say, or depth of channels or whatever else, why are those decisions made?
Those decisions being made by the CPA should be obviously following the development plan, which does not exist. So the situation is really compounded in the sense that the CPA is not only not making those decisions in public, but that they're making them without the benefit of that development plan. And clearly, the role of the Legislative Assembly in all of this, we raised this in our report, is somewhat lessened by the fact that these decisions are being made without that plan in place.
Yeah, I think Martin gets at the crux of the issue there. There's no development plan to guide decision making. There's no effective guide for the CPA against to work in approving plans and developments. So that is fundamental to all of this, is a plan to actually guide decisions.
Since we're talking about unlawfulness, if I recall, Section 19 of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution says something along the lines of decisions of government must be procedurally fair, proportionate, rational, and they have to tell people why they're doing what they're doing, and the CPA hasn't been doing that. You found in this report.
I think that's
the ultra vires again here with this.
Well, I haven't thought about that issue specifically, and it's a very well made point. But I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
But are they? Should they? You said they should be telling people just because it's the right thing to do. But
well,
are they going to run into legal trouble at this stage with the current framework that we have, or not?
At the moment, I can't see it. But from my perspective, there needs to be, for those reasons that you say from the Constitution, these decisions should be open and transparent. Right, the reasons why these decisions have been made, why, for example, any technical advice has been disregarded, why it wasn't considered appropriate, or whether they disagreed with it, and the reasons. And I think that would be entirely appropriate.
When we conduct audits, and in this one in particular, of course, we use the Constitution as a guide in terms of the principles it provides, and when we set out our criteria, for example, that decision should be open and transparent, they're in light of what is said in the Constitution and in the laws. So your point is well taken, Brent, but we're not lawyers. So we simply bring out, the fact that these documents, these instruments set out the principles, and we basically audit to those principles.
Sorry, gentlemen, it's me again. Obviously, you've been sort of very specific about the problems that exist, and you've made plenty of recommendations, and you've pointed out that government is in the process of doing more, and that we're being told a lot about new plans and projects. how do you see your report influencing perhaps the most significant one of all, which is going to be the port and the obvious environmental implications of that, given what you're saying about the destruction already of our environment over the last few years? And I mean, it seems that, it hasn't slowed down any. It's continuing. So we're facing yet again another massive environmental destruction, effectively. Do you think that this, or do you hope that this will have some influence on government's mind?
What I hope it has influences on how they go about the process of making these decisions. I'm not saying here that the ports are good or a bad idea, for example. I think this is about ensuring that they go through the right processes, like they go through the environmental impact assessments, they go through the economic impact assessments, they assess the information effectively to come up with the decision that they see as in the best interest of the Cayman Islands. And that's what we want them to see from this, is that they go through a clear decision-making process based on good processes, good practices, and which is open and transparent, and that's so people can see all the information. Ultimately, it comes down to a political decision about where you see the balance lying in that decision-making, and that's not for me. But hopefully it will help them, or should I say, influence the process they go through to make sure it's done robustly and effectively so that you can come up with the best decision that's in the interest of the Cayman Islands.
I've got another one actually as well, if you don't mind.
Go on.
Again, some of the things that you've pointed out, and that this has happened previously, we've had situations where you've pointed out in your report that the fact that the UK has also already pointed out some of the problems that we have with the lack of a development plan, and they were quite critical of and our issues with the environment. And we know that as far as the UK is concerned, when it comes to the territories, the environment is a big issue for them. You've reported on numerous occasions now about government being unlawful, not following the proper process, not doing this, not doing that right. Have you had any contact with the UK about this report in particular, because of the significance it has to absolutely everybody? There's no special interest here. It's a very significant report. Have you had any discussions with them?
We haven't had any discussions with the UK about this. But I think you come back to the issue about the development plan. I think that's fundamentally important in terms of if you're thinking about the balancing of the objectives between economic, social, and environmental objectives, i.e. sustainable development objectives. And this creation of a development plan would be fundamentally important to showing what balance we're looking to achieve as a country. And I think that's why that is so fundamentally important as well. You need to be clear about where you see the appropriate balance and what does protecting the environment mean in terms of development for the Cayman Islands. So then that's a clear gap at this moment in time. Actually, ultimately, Wendy, that's a policy decision they have to make,
Yeah, I got a couple more. Okay, so I'm struggling to find that Wendy mentioned this already about the land transaction in Cayman Brac, and then there was some other. There was the part in section 54. Oh, page 22. She says page 22. Thank you. And then number 54 about where it talks about guidelines for members of the CPA board. Did you in your work come across any specific decisions in the decisions you reviewed where conflicts of interest might have played a role in the decision making of the CPA?
We couldn't see that in any specific detail.
Okay, well, I guess I'm just curious. I mean, why mention it? It's just these things like on page 22 where they say the 125,000 land deal, which was or whatever it was for, we couldn't tell what it was for, and then the members of the boards didn't the guidelines don't disclose them. I mean, why bring this stuff up, I guess, is my... I mean, if you can't do anything... I mean, it's sort of like there's the appearance of impropriety, but we don't know if any actually occurred.
Well, That's because it's difficult and it's not transparent and difficult to see, to be honest. And I think those two issues are separate issues anyway. I think the transaction you're talking about was in relation to something that from the minister directed. In terms of the CPA, there has to be clear about their potential conflicts and what their interests are. They are involved in making some very significant decisions in the planning authority, and we have to know whether they have any potential conflicts. And that should be clear and set out up front. It shouldn't be on an as-you-go basis, because these decisions can have significant impact on the islands. So you need to know if they are influenced or are there any potential influences that could be had.
Okay, there's one more thing I needed to clarify. You made mention in the report that at a certain point there was concern that the entity involved in the NRA agreement might be taking legal action against the government. But at this stage, it's my understanding that that's been addressed, or they've worked out some sort of. That wasn't mentioned in the report, though.
No, well, that's in terms of the Third Amendment to the NRA agreement you're talking about. Well, that's still ongoing, obviously.
Okay.
But there is the risk, though, that by not honouring the signed agreement, that they can be held to the obligation. The government could be held to the obligations in that agreement, and they couldn't back out. And if they didn't hold to them, they could have been legally enforced in court. And that's just a basic contract law at the end of the day. So there is that challenge. Now, obviously, they're still trying to work with the other party to ensure that they come to a new agreement which is more amenable to government and which they think is appropriate.
Okay, so I'm just trying to pin down. You all still think there's the potential for legal action over that?
Well, it depends on. It depends on what decision government makes at the end of the day, whether they get a revised amendment, which is agreeable to them, or if they don't, whether they do not meet the terms of the agreement. And at that stage, there will be an legally enforceable that the other party will be able to potentially take them to court for that. But that's that's crystal ball gazing, and see what actually happens at this moment in time. But the contract is signed, so there's a clear legally enforceable obligation in there at this moment in time.
I just want to follow up on the CPA when you talk about conflicts of interest, because obviously without us having this standards in public life law, there isn't any requirement. There's no point beating about the bush. The chairman of that board is involved in the industry. I mean, do you think that's appropriate that for the person that is the largest sort of
I don't want to talk about individuals, but I think
construction merchant on the island is the chair of that board?
I don't want to talk about individuals specifically, but I think any board like this has to have an appropriate balance between the objectives of the government and the objectives of the people of the Cayman Islands. And obviously, from our perspective, the membership of the CPA at this moment is probably skewed towards the development industry. So, that raises concerns initially, that raises concerns that is there appropriate balance in decision-making processes that will happen. We're not saying that has impacted it, but that raises that perception. And that's what we're talking about to a large extent, are the perceptions of any conflicts or an appropriate influence there. And unless you address that through appropriate membership and putting balance into that membership, you will still have those questions.
One more for me. I promise this is the last one. But I have to go back, Mr. Swarbrick, on page 22, the instance where there appears to be at least the potential for, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there appears to be what you've said. There's a potential for a violation of the anti-corruption law, Section 13, breach of trust. Is that basically that's what we're talking about, right? Breach of trust?
Potentially.
Okay, potentially. I mean, that's a serious allegation, which you've put in your report. So did this get reported to the police or not?
Not at this time.
Okay, so I fail to understand if you believe that there was a criminal offense that occurred by the person who now holds a very high position in the government. Why do you not report that to the police? Isn't that a dereliction of your duty?
Mr. Fuller, I will be briefing the Anti-Corruption Commission on this report and all the various findings on it the next time we meet to discuss these issues. and we will to determine what appropriate action we'd consider at that stage.
Okay, so you will take it to the anti-corruption.
I take all my reports to the Anti-Corruption Commission, provide them a briefing, and we talk about specific key issues that arise in them as appropriate. So yes, it's a standing agenda item on the Anti-Corruption Commission.
Just to follow up a little bit, I'm not, pointing the finger, but has there been any response from the person to the allegation?
No.
Was she ever reproached?
We didn't speak to her specifically about this. The report is in their hands. All members have it, and have had it for 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be clear, this is the second time you've pointed the finger specifically at a serious potential breach of the corruption law of this specific former minister and current speaker. And I mean, have you had a react? So obviously, you're as a member of the ACC.
We had no reaction to this report at this time.
But what about the commissioner of police? I mean, he must. This is the second time you're going to go to him with the same person.
But I haven't had a discussion with the commissioner of police about this issue either, and I think he's been involved in other things that recently of more high profile at this moment in time. So this will be on the next agenda item. I can tell you of the Anti-Corruption Commission. This report, along with all my other reports that we've recently published, will be discussed for anything that they want to consider and maybe take forward.
When is that meeting?
To be determined, hopefully soon. In my last conversation, we technically have a quorum, but we have no independent members at this moment in time.
So at this time, I'd like to thank, I think that'll have to be the last question. Thank you very much for coming today, and I look forward to discussing this with you in the future.